Yeah, okay, so as you can see here, the Constitution of India. Today we will be learning about the Constitution of India, okay? Uh, you can look at the projector instead of me, okay? Everything it will be shown here. The constitutional framework and the preamble. Once we're done with the Constitution of India, we will switch to the preamble. Okay, these are the two topics that we will be covering today. The constitutional framework and the preamble. Okay, before we study the fundamental rights, the parliament, the president, the prime minister, the judiciary, and so forth, right? All the political terms, we must first understand the foundation on which all these institutions stand. Okay, the Constitution of India. Um, Many students they make the mistake of starting directly with the Constitution. But to truly understand the Constitution that's written here, we must first answer an important question. Where did it come from? Okay, where did it come from? How did India get its constitution? Yeah, we understand that the Indian constitution we adopted, enacted, and give to ourselves this constitution on 1949, 26th of November, right? And it came into force on 26th January 1950. Do you think it suddenly came into existence in 1950? No, okay? Our constitution is a result of nearly 2 centuries of constitutional evolution, okay? It did not just pop out in the year 1950. It constantly evolved, okay? It first began with the first constitutional act of 1773, which we call the Regulating Act of 1773, which was enacted by the British Parliament, the British government, right? And then on, they enacted different laws. They enacted and passed and passed and passed and passed, and all the way up till 1947. Okay, so the Indian Constitution that we know today is a collection of different laws, different acts passed by the British Parliament, right? It's called a borrowed constitution. But a large part of it has been borrowed from the British acts and legislations, okay? Like the Government of India Act 1935. It was a lot of things, the post of the governor, right? And so forth, they were borrowed from the Government of India Act 1935. So in order for us to understand the Constitution of India, we have to go all the way back. Okay, we have to go all the way back to 1773. We have to look at how different laws enacted by the British evolved, which eventually led to the Constitution of India. So we will be starting with the Regulating Act of 1773. Now, today's class, these are the learning objectives. You will be learning about the historical evolution of the Indian Constitution, why we begin with the Regulating Act of 1773 and how British constitutional reforms evolved over time. You will be learning about that, the important historical constitutional developments from 1773 all the way up to 1935 and then on to 1947 and how each one changed the administration of India. Okay, you will also be learning about the making of the constitution, why Indians they demanded their own constitution and how the Constituent Assembly was formed. Okay, you will also learn about that. And next we have the Constituent Assembly and the Drafting Committee. Okay, you will learn about the chairman of the Drafting Committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Okay, you will also learn about Rajendra Prasad, B.N. Rao, and so forth, and many others. Now you will also learn about the adoption and enforcement of the Constitution as well. And you will learn about the meaning and importance of the preamble, right? Its meaning, its philosophy, and why it is often called the soul of the Indian Constitution. You will learn about the keywords of the preamble. There are lots of keywords: sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, republic, right? And the ideals of justice, liberty, equality, and the spirit of fraternity. You will learn about that. And you will also learn about the constitutional amendments, specifically the 42nd constitutional amendment and the landmark Supreme Court judgments. Okay, there were lots of confusion whether the preamble should be a part of Indian Constitution or it shouldn't be a part of Indian Constitution. In this Kesavananda Bharati case, the Bereberu Union case, all these decided whether preamble should be part of Indian Constitution, whether it can be amended, whether it cannot be amended. So all these discussions you will learn about that in the amendment cases. And finally, we will have some exam revision structures that we're going to show towards the end of the presentation. So let's discuss the first, okay, historical evolution of the Indian Constitution. Now, if you look at this slide, slide number 3, you will see point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, point number 4. Very simple. Number 1, the company rule. The company rule, by that I mean the East India Company's rule. Okay, India was under the company rule, East India Company rule from 1608 till 1858. Right, it wasn't directly under the control of the British Crown. Okay, East India Company was a private trading company, right, that went all around the world. After they received the charter, they received the green light from the either the Queen or King of England, whichever was present at that time. Okay, now in 1608, they received after receiving a charter from the Queen, right? They came to India and they set up their trade centers in India. Okay, and it began their life in India began in 1608, and it ended in 1858. Why did it end in 1858? There was this revolt, okay? The Indians that revolted against the British in 1857. And in the year 1857, the British Crown decided, you East India companies, you guys are not capable, we blame you for the revolt, we're taking over fully. And from 1858 onwards, India was directly under the control of the British Crown, okay? So we will learn about what the different acts between 1608 and 1658. Now from 1858 till 1947, it was entirely Crown rule, okay? It was directly controlled by the British Crown, okay? It may be the King, it may be the Queen, right? But the British Crown, okay? And we will also will look at the Government of India Act 1935, right? And the Constituent Assembly, which was formed in 1946. We will learn about that eventually, right? All this, the acts between 1608 to 1858, and then on from 1858 to 1847, right? Different acts were passed, and a major act in 1935, which was passed, and in 1946, the Constituent Assembly was formed, and only after the Constituent Assembly was formed, the Constituent Assembly took the initiative of creating the Constitution of India. Okay, they gave B.R. Ambedkar the job of handling the making of the Constitution. He was the chairman of the drafting committee. Okay, along with other members, which we will talk about. And only after that, right? Only after that, 2 years, 11 months, right? 18 days. Only after that, in 1949, 26 November, they adopted it, and it came into force, right? It came into force on 26 January 1950. Okay, that's how the Indian Constitution evolved. First, during the Company's rule. Second, during the Crown rule, right? It went all the way up till 1947. So that's what the presentation shows. Now, you guys have an idea, right? An overview, an objective overview of how the Indian Constitution evolved. That's how the Indian Constitution evolved, okay? As you can see, the Indian Constitution evolved over 3 centuries of legislative history, from the arrival of the East India Company in 1608 to the enforcement of the Constitution on 26 January. Each era shaped the foundation of India's democratic and constitutional framework. Now let's begin with the Company rule, okay, 1773. Please please read Regulating Act of 1773, 81, and so forth. All these 5. Read it well. So the first is the Regulating Act of 1773, right? If you look at it, it's 1773. Why do we start from 1773? As I mentioned, because India originally had no written constitution, right? India originally had no written constitution. Now it began from 1773. It is important to understand why we are starting from 1773. Let me give you a short background, okay, of what happened before 1773. So they received the charter in 1600. Queen Elizabeth I gave the East India Company a charter saying that you can, trade in the East, right, of which India is a part of, okay. And in 1608, they arrived in India. They established its first trading post in India, and then they started trading from the year 1608 onwards, okay. And then the Mughal Empire, it was the main empire in India, right? When the Britishers came, we learned about that in our pre-foundational module. Okay, the Mughals were in power. Now the last powerful ruler, Aurangzeb. Okay, the last powerful ruler, Aurangzeb, he died in the year 1707. Okay, try to link it. Okay, he died in the year 1707, and then there was political instability in India. Okay, the Britishers, they took advantage of that, and they fought two battles against the Indians. The first being the First Battle of Plassey. Okay, 1757, right? 1757. It was led by Robert Clive. The Britishers were led by Robert Clive, right? And then the Indians were led by Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal. Okay, they fought, and then the British won. Okay, that was the first major victory of the British. Okay, and then on, the Indians, they tried to take revenge in 1664. Okay, in 1664, the battle was called Battle of Buxar. Okay, it was fought between the British and the Indians. The Britishers were led by Hector Munro, and then the Indians were a combination of three rulers. Okay, one is Shuja-ud-Dawla, right, the Nawab of Bengal. Another is Shah Alam II, right, the Mughal ruler. Okay, and then the next is Mir Qasim. Mir Qasim was the Nawab of Bengal. Nawab of Awadh was Shuja-ud-Dawla. Okay, all these three rulers, they combined, and then they fought against the British. But again, the British won. Okay, and after the British won, right? After the British won, they had an agreement. Okay, and according to the agreement, the Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor, he gave rights over Bengal, trading rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa to the Britishers. Okay, that's how the Britishers began to control certain parts of India, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Okay, and after they took control over it, they thought maybe we need a bit of stability, right? Maybe we need some laws, maybe we need some order, right? And then they enacted the Regulating Act of 1773, right? Which, as you can see, the first step towards British Parliament control over the company. Okay, now initially it was just Governor of Bengal. Okay, Governor of Bengal, right? Now they turned it to Governor General of Bengal. Okay, the Regulating Act of 1773. If you look at Indian history, okay, Warren Hastings, he became the Governor General in the year 1771. Okay, and after Lord Warren Hastings, he replaced Robert Clive. Right after Warren Hastings became the governor. The title Governor of Bengal was made the Governor General of Bengal, okay, from the Regulating Act of 1773. Okay, now it made the governors of Bombay and Madras. The governor of Bombay and Madras were called Governor of Bombay, Governor of Madras, right? But then Bengal, Governor General, which means it made the two governors of Bombay and Madras subordinate, okay, subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal, which means the governors of Bombay and Madras, they were under the Governor General of Bengal. Okay, that's what the Regulating Act of 1773 introduced. Okay, the Governor General of Bengal, and it also established the Supreme Court. Now you get it, right? The Indian Constitution, right? The evolution of Indian Constitution. We have the Supreme Court in the Indian Constitution. How did it evolve, right? The Supreme Court was initially established by the Regulating Act of 1773. Okay, so in the exam, in NPSA exam prelims, questions are asked a lot from these acts, okay, the evolution of the Indian Constitution, Regulating Act of 1773, all these acts, we received a lot of questions in the past, okay. We also received the exact question, right, which act changed the Governor of Bengal to the Governor General of Bengal, okay. And another question that we got was, who was the first Governor General of Bengal? Right, the answer is there, Warren Hastings. Okay. And another question that we got was, in which year was the first Supreme Court established in India? The year 1774. Okay, these are the three questions that we received in our past preliminary examination. So these facts are very important. These 3 to 4 facts. As long as you study these 3 to 4 facts, you're good enough. Okay. The tricky point is, it's not about trying to know everything. It's about trying to understand these simple 4 to 5 points of a particular act, memorizing it 100 times over, and making sure you don't forget it in the exam. That's all. It's all about retaining the simple ones, right? That makes you get through your preliminary examination. This is all that you need, okay, for Regulating Act of 1773, right? To make it less confusing, to make it less tedious for you to try to find other sources, PPT is supposed to be very simple, but I've kept it as comprehensive as possible in order for you guys to, if you guys cover just a presentation, you'll be very well ready for the preliminary examination. So I've added all the details. That's Regulating Act of 1773, okay? Now, and they also enacted another law in 1781, right? Now, in 1781, as you can see, they exempted the Governor General and the Council from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for acts done in their official capacity. Okay. The Governor General and the Council, right? First, initially when the Supreme Court was established by the Regulating Act of 1773, right? Even the Governor General was answerable to the court. Okay, but it gave the Governor General a certain level of autonomy in 1781, right? The Governor General, they complained, right, saying that if we're under the Supreme Court, then we'll be scared to take actions. We'll be scared to, try to expand the British territory. So we need a little bit of autonomy. We need a little bit of respect. Come on, give us some respect, okay? And then the Crown, they decided, okay, you guys deserve some respect, right? So they exempted the Governor General and the Council, which means his council, okay, from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for acts done in their official capacity. Now, it required also the Supreme Court to administer personal laws, okay? Hindu laws for Hindus and so forth. They started making laws. The Supreme Court started making laws, okay? Mohammedan laws for Muslims, right? So in preliminary, you might be asked, okay, which act gave Supreme Court the power to administer personal laws in India? So it's the Act of Settlement 1781, okay? Now, next we have Pitt's India Act 1784, okay? It established dual control, right? Dual control, meaning the Board of Control and Court of Directors. So in Regulating Act of 1773, I missed the last point, Court of Directors, the governing body of the company. They created a new body, okay, within the East India Company called Court of Directors. There were a number of directors, right? And so these people, they were engaged in the overall administration of the East India Company, okay? But in Pitt's India Act 1784, they also added another court called Court of Directors. Court of Control, okay? Along with the Court of Directors, they added Court of Control. So this Court of Control and Court of Directors, they were separate in the sense that Court of Control were for political affairs. Court of Control were for political affairs and Court of Directors for commercial affairs. You need to understand that the members of Court of Directors are the East India Company, okay? And then for Court of Control, political affairs, the members belong to the British Crown, okay? Directly appointed by the British Crown, the Board of Control. So it's called half-loaf because bread akashir grena utunchna like administrative, right? Or commercial or political and commercial or business, right? So East India Company only handled the business side of things, okay? From the Pitt's India Act 1784, the East India Company handled commercial affairs largely, okay? And then the political affairs were largely controlled by the British Crown, okay? With the introduction of Board of Control. Now, Act of 1786, okay? Now, Act of 76, again, Cornwallis, right, felt that, he needs to have the power to override the council's decision. His council, even if his council says this and that, it is not binding on, according to the Act of 1786, he doesn't need to listen, okay, to what the council decide. He has a full authority as the Governor General. Lord Cornwallis can override his council's decision, which means he can either listen or he can either reject. Okay, he has the power to override. So that's why the 17 Act of 1786. Now we received this question, and which is why I mentioned this explicitly. The question that we received was which act allowed Lord Cornwallis to override his council's decision. So the answer was Act of 1786. So for Act of 1786, this is the only thing that you need to memorize, okay, that you need to understand. The Act of 1786 is very little, but very important. Now, the Charter Act of 1793, okay, there were a series of Charter Acts. It was enacted every 20 years. Next page, we have the Charter Act of 1813, 1833, and 1853. So, Charter Acts were enacted every 20 years, okay, the first Charter Act being 1793. Now, if you look at the Charter Act of 1793, right, it extended the overriding power given to Lord Cornwallis, right, from in 1786, right, it extended it to all future governor generals. Okay, in 1786, right, Lord Cornwallis was given the power to override his council's decision, but in the Charter Act of 1793, it extended the power to all the future governor generals, which is to say, any future governor general after Lord Cornwallis, right, they had the same power of 1786. Okay, now the trade monopoly of the company in India, right, was extended by the British Crown. Okay, the British Crown said, you guys are doing good, right? We'll extend your contract for another 20 years to trade in India. Okay, they were always at the mercy of the British Crown. Okay, the East India Company, you have to understand that. They were always at the mercy of the British Crown. Next, we have the Charter Act of 1813. Okay, the Charter Act of 1813. Now, the Charter Act of 1813, the most important one being the end of monopoly. As you can see, they abolished the trade monopoly of the company in India. Okay, it is abolished the trade monopoly of the company in India. Company means East India Company. Okay, who abolished the trade monopoly? The British Crown. Okay, the British Crown. Profit bisi paile do suku jele do na. The kings, queens can be suku jele do. So they ended the trade monopoly of the company in India. Okay, so however, right, East India Community continue to monopoly over trade in tea and trade with China. And it asserted, right? See, suku juling na. It asserted the sovereignty of the British Crown over the company's territories in India, right? Now that the Britishers, the East India Community, were receiving a lot of profits, right, due to trade in India, right? The British Crown, they asserted their sovereignty, okay, over the company's territories in India. And they also allowed Christian missionaries to come in India, right? So, and they also authorized local governments in India to impose taxes on persons. Okay. Now let's move on to the Charter Act of 1833. The Charter Act of 1833, it is also known as St. Helena Act. Okay. The most important about the Charter Act of 1833 is the establishment of Governor General of India. Okay. First, we had what? Regulating Act of 1773, the governor of Bengal to the Governor General of Bengal, right? Now the Governor General of Bengal became Governor General of India in the Charter Act of 1833. Okay, very important. They usually they ask this question almost every single time. Okay, even last year I still remember, which act made the Governor General of Bengal the Governor General of India? This question was asked. Okay, so it is a very expected, highly expected question. The Governor of Bengal, the Governor General of Bengal, regulating Act of 1773. Governor General of Bengal, do Governor General of India, Charter Act of 1833. Okay, so the rest you will be able to understand it, right? But this is the most important point. Okay, now second point, right? It deprived the governors of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. Okay, so the governors of Bombay and Madras, they had legislative powers, right? The power to legislate laws. Okay, but the power was taken away from them, right? And the only legislative power was vested in the Governor General of India. Okay, which means the Governor General of Bengal. Okay. So the Governor General of India had the power to legislate laws for the entire India, beginning from the Charter Act of 1833. Okay. And then there's a very interesting fact about why it's called Saint Helena Egg. Saint Helena is an island. Okay, it's an island. Um, so during the Charter Act of 1833, the it's not important for us, which is why it's not mentioned here, and it's not mentioned in any book. Okay, but the reason why they call it Saint Helena is because when the British Crown enacted the Charter Act of 1833, they also took away Saint Helena from the hands of the East India Company. Okay, it hurt the East India Company greatly, right? It affected the profit, so it's also called Saint Helena Egg. Okay, the taking away of island from the East India Company by the British Crown. Okay, now in 1853, let's move on to 1853. Right, this act it introduced legislative council. Okay, first is the separation of powers. It separated legislative and executive function of the Governor General's Council. Okay, and this might be a little confusing, but if you go to the next line, we will take a look at the Legislative Council, right? Legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. It established a separate six-member Governor General's Legislative Council. It was also known as the Indian Central Legislative Council, functioning as mini parliament. Now, what do we understand from that? Legislative Council, okay, was created, right? Six-member Legislative Council was created, right? It functioned as a mini parliament. But the executive, right? Legislative, they'll give votes, they'll pass laws, but executive means the one with the real power, right? Like in the case of the Indian Parliament, we have the members of Parliament as the legislative, okay? But then the ministers are the executive, right? The officials of each India committee, they retain the executive power, okay? But they also created legislative council, and you will know that it introduced local representation in the Indian Legislative Council for the first time. Legislative Council they India Manukan Thaliase, and they were given very little power, but Executive Council was entirely controlled by the British, okay, headed by the Governor General. They created Legislative Council just to try to show a little bit of peaceful gesture to the Indians, saying that, we're not your enemy. You guys can still be a part of the decision making process in India, okay? So that was the entire idea. But the Legislative Council, they were given very little power, whereas the executive, okay, the executive was fully at the hands of the Governor General of India. Okay, very tricky, right? The Britishers, very tricky. So it also introduced the open competitive competition for civil services. Okay. Now the Charter Act of 1813. Open in the third point we see open competition system with civil servants, right? The Macaulay Committee was appointed in 1854 after the Charter Act of 1853, right? The Charter Act of 1853 stated that open competitive exam thakibo, which we know today as Indian Administrative Service, right? UPSC exam, right? Or NPSC exam, open competitive exam. It's mentioned in the Indian Constitution, right? How did it evolve from the Charter Act of 1853? Now all of you are connecting the points, right? Of how the Indian Constitution came into being, okay? Now next we have the Government of India Act 1858. Now, like I said, in the Government of India Act 1858, it was enacted in the wake of the revolt of 1857. In the revolt of 1857, okay. Now, I've already told you that the British Crown, they blamed the East India Company for the revolt, right, in 1857, and as a result of which, the British Crown decided to take full control over the East India Company's control in India. Okay, so 1858, it was the year 1858 that the British Crown took direct control over British territories in India. Okay, the designation of Governor General, they changed it to Viceroy of India. Okay, and the Viceroy of India was a direct representative of the British Crown. Now the first Viceroy is Lord Canning. Okay, the first Viceroy is Lord Canning. Now, it also ended the double government. What is the dual government? We studied earlier, right? The Board of Directors and the Board of Control. Okay. Now, the Board of Control and the Board of Directors, the Board of Directors was introduced by the Regulating Act of 1773, right? And in BITS India Act 1784, they introduced Board of Control. Now, both these two uh, bodies were abolished, okay, by the Government of India Act 1858. Right. So three very important points in Government of India Act. The company ended. Right. The company senior company ended, and then the Viceroy was introduced, and then the Secretary of State for India was established. Okay. Those the Secretary of State for India. A lot of students get confused here. Okay. The Viceroy, the Secretary of State for India. Kun head as a kun head nai. No, the Secretary of State for India is not a member of the East India Company. The Secretary of State for So the Viceroy and the Secretary of State for India. The Secretary of State for India was a member of British Parliament. Okay, he did not reside in India, right? He resided in Britain. Okay, he was a member of like Lok Sabha la MB nishna British Parliament la MB do ekta choose created every time to serve as the Secretary of State for India, right? So the difference is that the Viceroy was the head of the East India Company. Okay, he was a member of the East India Company. The Viceroy was answerable to the Secretary of State for India. The Secretary of State for India was answerable to the British Parliament. Okay, because he's a member of the British Parliament, right? So that's how you have to connect the dots. Okay, the Secretary of State for India resided in London or anywhere in England, right? And then he received the messages, the updates from the Viceroy of India, who was in India, ruling India. Okay, that's the difference between the Secretary of State for India and the Viceroy. The Government of India Act 1858, right? You have to know that from 1858, India is ruled directly by the Crown, okay, British Crown, right? Or at the time by the Queen. Then once India was directly under the British Crown, they enacted new laws. Okay, the first act being Indian Councils Act of 1861, and then comes 1892, right? And then comes 1909, and then comes 1919, right? Indian Councils Act of 1861. Okay. Now, in Indian Councils Act of 1861, it was the beginning of representation. Okay, beginning of representation. Now, by representation, what do we mean? They associated Indians with the lawmaking process. Lord Canning, who was the viceroy, nominated three Indians. Okay, Raja of Benares, Maharaja of Badela, and Sir Tinkar Rao. By the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Okay, the first Indians, these three Indians, they entered the lawmaking process, right? And it was the beginning of representative government. Okay, Indians were represented, right? So this 1861 Act, and now another point, decentralization. Okay, they restored the legislative powers to Bombay and Madras presidencies. In 1833, we studied, right, that Bombay and Madras, they used to legislate. Okay, they used to make laws, but it was taken over by the Governor General of India, who was Warren Hastings at the time, right? 1833, the Act of 1833 introduced or upgraded the Governor General of Bengal to the Governor General of India, right? And then 1833 took away the powers of Bombay and Madras governors to legislate. Now, in Indian Councils Act 1861, restore the power to legislate to the governors of Bombay and Madras. Now, all three governors, the viceroy as well as the two governor generals, could make laws, pass laws. Okay, they have legislative powers. Now, the Indian Councils Act of 1892, okay, it again increased. Not that important of a point, but they increased the number of non-official members in central and provincial legislative councils. Okay, central and provincial means you understand, right? Provincial means province based. Okay, province based, and central means the main central government. The non-official members means non-official means Indian members. Okay, non-official. Official means it's always easy in the company. Non-official means Indians. So in the Indian Council Act of 1892, they increased the number of non-official members in both central and provincial legislative councils. Okay. Now the budget power, it increased the functions of legislative council, giving them the power of discussing. Right? It's only about discussing. Very important point. Okay. The budget, they had no power. Technically speaking, they could only discuss, right? They could only discuss. They could not vote. Okay, they could not vote on the budget. So if we cannot vote on the budget, what's the point of discussing, right? Even if the Indians will deserve such and such course, if they don't have the power to vote, it's meaningless. So it's another diplomatic move by the British government, right, to engage the Indians in the budget thing, and still not give them power, not give the Indians power. Okay, very tricky diplomatic law passed by the British. Okay, budget could be discussed but not voted upon. Okay, so the Indians continued the pressure, right? Dalabai Naoroji and so forth. Again, they started to criticize the British government. Why would you even enact this law? What's the point of even discussing the budget, right? Discussing about money when you cannot even vote. Okay, so the Indian Council Act of 1892, it increased the number of non-official members, right? And it gave the non-official members the power of discussing the budget, right? It also introduced the principle of representation through the indirect election, though the word election was not used. Okay, you will learn about that later. Now, Indian Council Act of 1901 is also called Morley-Minto reforms. Okay, 1909. So here in the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, the good point is that the Indians, they entered councils. Okay, as you can see, during that time, Lord Morley was Secretary of State, right? Like I said, Secretary of State, the member of the British Parliament. Lord Morley was the Secretary of State. Lord Minto was the Viceroy. Okay, so both of them together combined, they introduced the Indian Council Act of 1909, which is why it is called Morley-Minto. Okay, it increased the size of Legislative Council from 16 to 60 at the center. Okay, central there. Legislative Council last size to 16 to 60. Okay, and it permitted a non-official majority in the provincial legislative council. Now, even if, what's the point, right? Province so chutu asdo, that they majority because of the pressure. In 1909, though, by the time, the Indian National Congress, they were pressuring the Indian government, right? The Indian INC was formed in the year 1885, right? And the INC kept on demanding independence, demanding sovereignty, demanding freedom, and because of the pressure, they increased the members of Legislative Council in the center, and in the but majority was still the Britishers. Okay, in the center, the majority was the British, but in the provincial Legislative Council, they allowed the Indians to be the majority. Okay, but center the takad na ito, Indians come na. So another very diplomatic move. And then we will also see communal electorate. Communal electorate. It introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Now, communal electorate. So just imagine that the Christians can vote for the Christians and the Muslims can vote for the Muslims. That's what separate electorate is all about. Okay. So they which is why it is called communal electorate, right? Because they try to create division between the Hindus and the Muslims. Okay, another very diplomatic move by the British government to create separate electorate, right? The Hindus, they were against it, like the Muslims, they were happy, okay, about it. So they tried to divide the Hindus and Muslims, which is why they created the separate electorate. Okay, this particular act of 1909, it planted the seeds of communal politics in India. Okay, instead of everyone voting together, the Muslims, they voted separately for the Muslim candidates. So that's what separate electorate is all about. Okay, now in 1919, henceforth reforms. Now, supposing you can choose your clothes, okay, but for example, your father, okay, your father tells you that you can choose to buy whichever clothes you wish to buy, you can choose to get whichever tablet you wish to get, you can buy anything you want, but I control the money, right? I let you enjoy with the money, but I control the money. Hierarchy is an example of that, okay? Hierarchy, right? Uh, this is hierarchy. Some powers are given, but actual power was under the control of the British government, okay? Now, if you look at it, hierarchy divided provincial subjects into hierarchy was introduced only in the province, not center. Okay, so we're going to study about the hierarchy in province. There were two subjects: the transferred and the reserve. Okay, reserve subjects to British lahatte thakishido, and transferred subjects to Indians kan lahatte. Okay, so they transferred some subjects like for the Indians to enjoy, right? Buying clothes, buying cars, or whatever. Just an example, okay? Just a metaphorical statement. They transferred certain subjects, right? Like education, agriculture. These were transferred subjects, okay? Not too important, okay? And then local self government, public health. These were transferred subjects, okay? Very chutu mutu subjects, which were transferred to the Indians, okay? Indian ministers, the Indian ministers. And then we have the reserve subjects, which were reserved for the British, okay, the governor and his executive council. Now the subjects were police, law and order, right, and finance and so forth. Okay, so they control the money, they control the police, they control the law and order, right? The Britishers, the governor general and his executive council. Another very diplomatic move by the British government to still retain control of the important portfolios and give away the less important portfolios to keep the Indians happy. Okay, so this introduced hierarchy in the province. Okay, transferred and reserved subjects. Very interesting, right? Now, bicameralism and direct elections. It replaced the Indian Legislative Council, which we had back then, with a bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house and a lower house. Now, upper house, lower house, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, right? So it was derived from the Indian Constitution of 1919. Okay, upper house and lower house. But it was a little different. You only need to know that it replaced the Indian Legislative Council with bicameral. Okay, upper house and lower house. And it required 3 of the 6 members of Viceroy's Executive Council to be Indian. Now, finally, because of the pressure of the Indians, right, in the Viceroy's Executive Council, 3 of the 6 members were to be Indian. Okay, and in the next point, we can see that it extended the principle of communal representation. Now, 1909, right? If you look back in 1909, the separate electorate was only for the Muslims. Okay, and in 1919, they extended it to 6 Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, and Europeans. Okay, separate electorate. Right. So again, creating more disunity. Okay, creating more enmity. It created a new office of High Commissioner for India in London. Okay, High Commissioner, which was in London, the office. It created the post, and it also provided for the establishment of Central Public Service Commission, which we know now today as UPSC. Okay, the 1919 Act, right, established the Central Public Service Commission, which was set up in 1926. Okay, so now we will move to the Government of India Act 1935. Okay, so it is often called the blueprint of the Indian Constitution. Okay, why is it called the blueprint of the Indian Constitution? Because our Constitution borrowed many features from it. Okay, it borrowed a lot of features from the Government of India Act 1935. And one very interesting fact, okay, that all of you should understand, even if they introduced the Government of India Act 1935, right, the Indians, they did not accept it, okay. So India continued to be ruled, right, in accordance with the Government of India Act 1919 till independence. Okay, the Government of India Act 1935 was never implemented. Okay, it was never implemented, but a lot of these features were incorporated in the Indian Constitution. Like, for example, we have the Public Service Commission, we have the governor, we have the federal court in 1935 Act, we have the RBI Reserve Bank of India, right, and so forth. All these were part of the Government of India Act 1935. Okay, you can see that key institutions, federal court, which we know now as Supreme Court, right. The Supreme Court Regulating Act of 1773 established the Supreme Court, but its functions and powers were mainly taken from the Government of India Act 1935. Okay, and the Reserve Bank of India that we know now today, which we discussed about in the pre-foundation class, and also the Public Service Commissions. Okay, so the Government of India Act 1935, they are not going to be asking you much about its features because it was never implemented. Okay, so you just need to know some key institutions, and it also provided provincial autonomy, right? It was the directly was abolished. Directly was abolished at the province and introduced in the center. This is a very important point. Okay, directly abolished. We learned about directly earlier, right? We learned about directly earlier. The rule of two, double directly. It was abolished at the province and introduced at the center. Okay. Now the federal structure, right? Federal, provincial, and concurrent lease. Okay. Federal. We talked about federalism, right? Union, the division of powers within the union and the states. Okay, this idea also came from the Government of India Act 1935. It established a federal scheme with the center, state division of powers. They divided the powers within the center and the state. Okay, so this Government of India Act introduced the provincial autonomy, key institutions, and the federal structure. That's the only thing you guys need to know about the Government of India Act 1935. Very important point, India will continue to be ruled in accordance with the provisions of Government of India Act 1919 till independence, because 1935 was never implemented. Very important point to be noted, okay? Now, making of the Constitution. Now, we learned about the Charter Acts, right? We learned about the Indian Councils Act. We learned about the Government of India Act 1935. Now, we will talk about the making of the Indian Constitution. Okay, so in the making of the Indian Constitution, we can see that point number one, demand for Constitution, call for a self-government Indian Constitution, and next, Cabinet Mission Plan 1946, plan to frame the Constitution. Number three, Constituent Assembly. So now we look at point one. Okay, the demand for Constitution was initially made by M.N. Roy. Okay, in 1934, it demanded a separate constitution for India, which was not given by the Britishers. Okay, and so the Britishers. They also tried different ways to try to appease to the Indians, but they were not able to do that. Lastly, okay, the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 explicitly mentioned that the Indians could draft their own constitution. Okay, the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, right? It mentioned that the Indians could create their own constitution. Okay, it was before independence, right? So the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, right? It also established the Constituent Assembly. Constituent Assembly, okay, temporary assembly, right? And they were elected, right? Elections were held, and they were elected to draft the Constitution. Okay, the Constituent Assembly. And then the drafting committee for the Constitution was chaired by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Okay, in the year 1947. Okay, the drafting committee was created in the year 1947. Okay. Now, if you look at the drafting committee and the Constituent Assembly, please take a look at the Constituent Assembly. It was constituted in 1947, 1946 under the Cabinet Mission Plan, like I've mentioned, right? And they conducted the elections and so forth, right? Originally, it had 389 members. No, partition. Okay, partition po ito. 1947 din na, based on the Mountbatten Plan. Okay, the Act of Independence, 1947. After that, the final strength was 299 because the rest, they went to Pakistan, right? And then some, they went to East Pakistan, which we know today as Bangladesh. Okay. So the assembly made for 2 years, 11 months and 18 days to draft the constitution. Okay. Now, if you were asked, who created the Indian Constitution? Who created the Indian Constitution? If you were asked, who created the Indian Constitution? Don't say Ambedkar, okay? Ambedkar chaired the committee for creating the Indian Constitution, but the Indian Constitution was created by the Constituent Assembly, okay? The Constituent Assembly. Now, a lot of people contributed to it, right? The president of the Constituent Assembly was Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Okay, the chairman of the drafting committee was Ambedkar, who is also known as father of Indian Constitution, not creator, okay, father of Indian Constitution. And then the constitutional advisor, B.N. Rao. Okay, B.N. Rao was very intellectual. If you research on him, you will find that he was very intellectual. Okay, he drafted the initial constitutional framework, the basic structure, right? And he also kept on advising the assembly on how to create the constitution. Okay. So, as we can see in the objective resolution, okay. Now we're talking about the preamble in the constitution, right? As the Constituent Assembly was formed in 1946, right? They also Jawaharlal Nehru also issued a declaration, okay? Issued a declaration on December 13, 1946, right? After the Constituent Assembly was created in 1946, right? Jawaharlal Nehru issued a declaration, okay? Declaration very similar to the preamble, okay? So this declaration showed the philosophy of the constitutional structure, okay? It openly declared the philosophy of the constitutional structure, right? Which later on became the preamble. Okay, it goes something like we the people of India and so forth, and this and that, right? Like India is a federal republic, India is like a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and so forth. Jawaharlal Nehru, he issued a statement, okay, which we call objective resolution, right? That was a resolution showing the objectives of the Indian Constitution, okay? So, which is why it is called objective resolution. And Jawaharlal Nehru pointed out the fundamentals, the philosophy of the constitutional structure. Okay, it proclaimed India as an independent, sovereign, and republic. Okay, so it was adopted by the Assembly on January 22, 1947. Okay, so in the exam link, it's modified version from the preamble of the present constitution. In the exam, they might ask you this particular question, right? The preamble of the Indian Constitution is derived from which of the following, right? The right answer is objective resolution. Okay, so now we'll look at the changes created by the Indian. Now we are done with Government of India Act 1935, right? Now we move to 1947. Okay, once the Mountbatten Plan was accepted, the princely states and Muslim League members from the Indian dominant joined the Constituent Assembly. CA means Constituent Assembly. Now, it might be a little confusing, right? Didn't Muslim League move away to Pakistan, or let's say East Pakistan? Why is it mentioned that they joined the Constituent Assembly of India? I'm talking about the Muslims, right? That did not go to Pakistan, that did not go to Bangladesh. Muslims that remained in India, okay, they joined the Constituent Assembly, and even the princely states, okay, they joined the Constituent Assembly, right? People who went, they went, but people who did not go, they joined the Constituent Assembly of India, okay. Now, the Government of India Act made three key changes. Number one, fully sovereign body. Okay. Now it gave the Constituent Assembly full power, sovereign power. Ito the India do fully sovereign huije shegui na do Government of India Act 1947 ra declare today. And then two separate functions, right? One of the Constituent Assembly. Okay, we're talking about just understand the Independence Act of 1947 from the perspective of the Indian Constitution. Okay, that's all we're trying to study. Okay, we'll learn about the different features of 1947 Act in your history class. Okay, now it's about the Indian Constitution, right? So, according to the Indian Independence Act of 1947, it became a fully sovereign body. Okay, it became a fully sovereign body, meaning the Assembly could alter, make any changes to laws made by the British Parliament in relation to India. Okay, so they changed it, right? They made a lot of changes, and the Constituent Assembly had two separate functions. One is to be a constituent body, right? Constituent body chaired by Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Okay, And another is legislative body, which means make laws, right? Constituent body create the constitution, right? And legislative body means make laws, okay? Two separate functions, right? Constituent body and a legislative body. Now the strength was reduced, like I said initially, uh, 389 to 299, right? Muslim League members from Pakistan they withdrew, right? And then it was eventually reduced from 296 to 229. And then the priestly states, right? Priestly states were those states like in India during the partition, right? Which the Britishers categorized as princely states because they were ruled by their respective kings. Okay, so these princely states, some of them joined Pakistan, some of them joined India, right? So accordingly, plus minus Purna, last year 229 Pajisha, British India seats, and then princely states 93 was 70. Okay, so the chairman of the constituent body, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, or the Constituent Assembly, and the chairman of the legislative body, G.V. Mavalankar, first speaker. Okay, very important point. Now, drafting committee. Now, the drafting committee was a committee that was. The drafting committee was a committee that was created for building the constitution, right? Indian constitution, and its chairman was B.R. Ambedkar, who is also known as the father of Indian constitution. Okay, B.R. Ambedkar was the father of Indian constitution, and it also had members, 6 members who assisted in drafting. We can look at it. Aladi Krishna Swami Iyer, right, and along with him K.M. Munshi, Kabala Swami. You have to memorize all these 6. Okay, memorization mandatory as it for constituent for drafting committee. All of them combined, they worked so hard, and then they created the Constituent Assembly. Right? It was instituted in 1947. It was completed in 1949. Okay, 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days. Right? That's what it took for them to submit their report. Now, adoption and enforcement. After they submitted it, right? They formally adopted. Okay, on 26 November 1949. And then it came into force on 26 January 1950. Okay, so why 1950? Why January 26? Can anyone answer? Why January 26, 1950 was the day when it came into force? Because of the Purna Swaraj resolution of 1929, okay, on December 19, 1929, they declared the Purna Swaraj resolution was passed on December 19, 1929, and they declared 26 January 1930 as the Swarajya Day, which means the day of independence. Okay, they declared 26 January 1930 as the day of independence, and which is why after India got independence, they chose 26 January, okay, as the day that the Indian Constitution comes into force. Okay. Now we move on to. So you guys have seen the preamble, right? We the people, and the core objectives and the key highlighted terms. Now, 4 key elements of the preamble, okay? The 4 elements of the preamble. Number 1, source of authority. The preamble states that we the people, we are the source of authority. Okay, we derive, the constitution derives its power from the citizens of India. Okay, you have to understand. They'll ask you a question according to the preamble of the Indian Constitution. What is the source of authority? Answer is we the people. Okay, and I've made. Now you look at the nature of the state: sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, republic. Okay, you look at the objectives of the state: justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Okay. Now, just an example. Two students they cheat in an exam. Okay. Two students they cheat in an exam. Uh, one is punished because he's poor, Tukia Manuaze, and another is forgiven because he comes from a very rich family. Do you think that's justice? No, right? So justice means that everyone should be treated fairly. Okay, justice simply means that everyone should be treated fairly. So this is what justice is about, right? And no one should get special treatment because of their religion, caste, money, or let's say political influence. Now we look at liberty. Okay, liberty simply means freedom. Okay. Now, can your teacher, right? As a teacher, can I force you to believe in a certain ideology? No, right? Can I force you to convert from your Christian beliefs to your Hindu beliefs? No. Okay, you have the liberty to choose your own religion. You have the liberty to decide for yourself the ideology that you believe is best for yourself, right? Liberty simply means freedom. But we also have to understand that the Indian Constitution gives you freedom within the limits, okay, of the Indian Constitution itself. You can enjoy, but make sure you don't hurt other people in the process of your enjoyment, right? You can listen to music, but don't let the music be loud enough that you disturb the neighbors, okay? Kung maka name na dyan na kan bibisya sa do, dunia din na, to bike kan radi din, mata di uti na. It's something of that kind, okay? So you can enjoy your freedom, but make sure you don't disturb other people, okay? Equality. Just imagine that there are two students with very good marks, okay, let's say 99 out of 100, and one student gets admission because of merit, while the other is rejected because of his, let's say, surname, right? We have a lot of caste system in India, or let's say it's an institution owned by one community, and then this is take the example of I don't want to. But let's just choose one tribe, okay? Angami. Kohima there, two students, they get very good marks, okay? 99, 99 each. One gets admitted, but the other one doesn't get admitted because that person is, let's say, Sumi, right? The Angamis, right? They did not choose Sumi because of his surname, okay? So is that equality? No, it's not equality, right? So that's what equality is all about, okay? Equality means everyone is equal before the law and everyone should get equal opportunities. It's mentioned in the fundamental rights, which we will learn about later in part 3 of the Indian Constitution. So the example of equality can be many. Everyone stands in the same queue at the bank, right? We all follow the same traffic rules, and then a minister and an ordinary citizen can both be punished for the same offense, right? The severity of punishment is the same for the minister as well as the ordinary public. So that's what equality is all about. Okay, now talking about fraternity, right? All of you are combinations of different tribes. We have the Aus, we have the Poms, we have the Sangdam, right, and so forth. The Konyak. All of you are united here, right? What does it? All of you are working together, helping one another out. What does it show? Unity, right? Even in the previous page, okay, we had a lot of students from different communities. We had the Sumis, we have the Angamis, and everyone. All of them were very supportive of one another. They helped each other. It was a very engaging batch. Okay, so what do we learn from this? We learn unity, right? That's what fraternity is all about. Okay, fraternity means brotherhood. I'm talking about the objectives of the state. Okay, and the preamble, the four objectives: the justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Okay, fraternity means brotherhood, mutual respect, or you could say national unity, respecting everyone's dignity and coming together as brothers and sisters. That's what fraternity is all about. So these four are the core objectives of the preamble. Okay, now the nature of the state: we have the sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, and republic. Now, sovereign, we talked about it. It means independent, right? No foreign control. And so we have the socialist. What is socialism? It is the belief that a country's economy should be owned by the community, right? So in our case, socialist means a welfare state. Okay, the government works for the welfare of the public. The government works for social justice, right? That's what socialist is about. And when it comes to secular, it means freedom of religion, right? There will be no single state religion. There will be no single state religion. Every citizen of India has a freedom to choose their own religion. Okay, we have equal respect for all religions, and democratic means people choose their own government, right? People choose their government. That's what democratic is all about. And republic means the head of the state, the head of the Indian, uh, the head of India is elected. Okay, it is not hereditary, which is why we call it a republic. Okay, so the source of authority is we the people of India. The nature of the state, the nature of India is sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, and republic. Right. The objectives of this state: justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Okay. The date of adoption: 26 November 1949, which we discussed about earlier, and it came into force on 26 January 1950. Okay. Now the 42nd Constitutional Amendment of 1976. The reason why I've mentioned it is because it made changes to the preamble. Okay, the preamble was amended only once. Okay, hasn't been amended ever since that. So which is why it's very important, the 42nd Amendment Act. Okay, now socialist, secular, and integrity. These three are missing in the original preamble. Socialist, now in the after preamble, right? We have the sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, republic. Okay, socialist and secular and integrity were added by the 42nd Amendment of 1976. Okay, so these three are missing in the original preamble. After the 42nd Constitutional Amendment of 1976, we have socialist, secular, and integrity. Okay, these three were aided by the amendment for the second amendment. So very easy to understand, right? Oh yes, it's mentioned here words aided, socialist, secular, and integrity. Okay, so this is all about for the second amendment. We for the second amendment introduce a lot of things. Okay, you will learn about that in history class. Now we're only looking at the 42nd Constitution Amendment from a constitutional perspective. Okay. Now, important Supreme Court cases related to preamble. Again, related to preamble. Okay. Now, there's two cases. One is the Baru Union case. Okay, the Baru Union case, 1960. Court take the case it was about it's a different issue. Okay, it's a different issue. I'll explain to you later in history class. It's a very unique issue, but in that issue, they talked about the preamble. Okay, preamble, and in that issue, in that case, the Supreme Court decided that the preamble is not a part of the Constitution. Okay, preamble the Constitution language. It's separate from the Indian Constitution, and therefore it cannot be enforced in a court of law. Okay, 1960. But in Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973, the Supreme Court, right, they can decided that preamble is a part of the Constitution. So what does it show? Even the Supreme Court isn't all perfect. Okay, they can get some things wrong, they can get some things right. We constantly evolve. The only thing that's constant in this world is change. Okay, so they realized that it was a little wrong to consider preamble as not part of the Constitution. So in 1973, they declared that preamble is a part of the Constitution. Okay, and it can be amended. Preamble can be amended, but they inserted a very important caveat, which means preamble can be amended, but it cannot be amended in such a way that it stops being sovereign, socialist, and secular. Okay, the basic structured doctrine. That's what it's all about. Basic structured doctrine means sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic with the basic feature of the Indian Constitution, right? That's called basic structured doctrine. Very important point. Okay, so the Supreme Court they declared that the Parliament can amend, can make changes to the preamble, but they cannot make changes to the basic structure of the preamble, the basic freedom, the basic right. Okay, very important point in the Kesavananda Bharati case. So the Kesavananda Bharati established that the preamble is a part of the constitution. Okay, and introduced the basic structured doctrine. Which case introduced the basic structured doctrine? 그래도 Kesavananda Bharati case আছে. Okay. Now, just a revision, okay? But very important point to be noted, preamble is non-justiciable, which means it cannot be enforced in court. Okay, you cannot go to court using arguments derived from the preamble. Okay, you cannot so. But the preamble mentions that India has sovereign socialism. No, they won't listen to you. Okay, there's part 1, the part 25 that you can use, but not the preamble. The preamble is just a preface, an introduction to the Indian Constitution, which means you cannot use the preamble, right, to support you in a court case. Okay, it's not enforceable in the court. Now, very PYQ examination facts. Date of adoption is very important, right? Constitution adopted. There's date of enforcement, right? It came into force on 26 January 1950. The source of authority, we the people. Okay, the 42nd Amendment added socialist secular integrity to preamble. Very important. Okay, very important. Yeah. So we have come to the end of the session. Now, do you guys have any doubt regarding the preamble? If you guys have any doubt,